All right, Facebook, welcome. Glad you are here with me. If you're here with me, I'm coming live from Zoom, so I really can't see if you are watching me now or not. However, we are live coming on here. And so this is kind of a second live from the Oasis. I wanted to redo the message that I did last week because we had problems with the recording. It shut off. Some people said that the sound quality wasn't very good. Wanted to make sure we get this message recorded. So I am recording it again. So join me tonight on this Shabbat evening for a study in God's Word. Let's pray. Father, we thank you in Jesus' name for your Holy Spirit. As always, we ask, as David prayed, Lord, show us your ways, teach us your paths. Lead and guide us into your truth and teach us. You are the God of our salvation, and we look to you all the day. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. So we are in this study, Who's the Boss? Women and Men in Biblical and Cultural Context. And we've been talking about this in the New Testament, but from the perspective of Christ as the ideal king. And we've talked about the fact that there was this concept within both the Greco-Roman world and in Judaism of the good king or the ideal king, as Julian Smith says in his book. As a matter of fact, I have the book right here, Christ the Ideal, there it is, Christ the Ideal King. He talks about this concept or this idea of the ideal king that was to come. And what this ideal king would do is that he would restore harmony. He would restore unity among the people. And one of the things that Julian Smith talks about in his book is that Christ in the book of Ephesians, and I would say throughout the rest of the New Testament, is portrayed as the ideal king. And what the ideal king would do is that he would come to restore what was fractured and broken within the cosmos, that the cosmos was fractured and broken, and that the ideal king would come to restore unity and harmony. He would come to restore and to heal what was broken. And one of the areas that we've already seen and covered in past session, one of the areas that was broken was male and female relationships. And we see this from the book of Genesis. From my point of view, from an egalitarian or mutualist point of view, we see Genesis chapter 3 as a fracturing of the male-female relationship. Let me say too that there are some complementarians who also see Genesis 3, not all, but many complementarians, I shouldn't say many, there are some complementarians who see Genesis 3 also as a fracture in the relationship, that when God says to Eve, your desire shall be for your husband and he shall rule over you, that is a fracturing of the relationship. It's not what God meant to be. What he intended the relationship to be. Originally, we see God's original intent in Genesis chapter 1, where he says, let us make man after our image and after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the earth. And then it says, male and female, he created them. And to the male and female, he said, I give you authority and dominion over the earth. That was God's original intent that was broken by sin in Genesis chapter 3. So what I am saying is that Christ, as the ideal king who has come to restore the what is broken and fractured, he came to restore harmony and equality between men and women, not just ontological equality, but functional, what I'm going to call functional equality. Not that just men and women have the same worth and value. In one sense, that's a given because we are all created in the image of God. If you're not sure about that, read Carmen Imes' book, Bearing God's Image, or Bearing His Image, Bearing God's Image, Bearing His Image. One of those titles, you can check it out. Okay, she talks about that. But here's the thing, when you get to the first century Greco-Roman world, and in some aspects of Judaism, some of the commentators, some of the philosophers and teachers where Judaism is concerned, the view of women goes down, okay? That women are seen as dangerous, that women are seen as promiscuous, that women are seen as those who will bring down men. Women are seen as smart. They're not seen as possessing the same self-control that men had. This was kind of the general view of women by the first century. In the first century world into which Jesus came, this was the view of women. So what I'm arguing is that Jesus came to restore the ontological equality, showing that men and women do have the same value, but also he came to restore the functional quality, meaning that they could operate in many, if not, well, they could operate in the same functions in terms of leadership in both in the home and in the church. They could operate in these together. Now, in saying that, we're not saying that men and women are exactly the same. We're not the same. We are different. But in terms of certain functionaries or functions that they can do in the home and in the church, there is equality. And what I'm arguing is that, and as we're going to see further and further as we move in this study, Jesus came to restore that, and he did restore that. So we saw last week, as we begin to build on this, we began looking at the fact, and we began asking, were there female apostles and leaders, or I'll put it like this first, were there female leaders in the Jesus movement, which could lead to asking the question, were there female apostles in the early Jesus movement? And we saw last week the possibility, and the answer to that is yes. We saw last week the possibility that when Jesus sent out the disciples, he sent out the 12, he sent out the 70 or the 72, depending on which manuscript you're reading. We saw the possibility that Jesus sending out the disciples 2 by 2, which is duo in Greek, could very well refer to Jesus sending male and female disciples out together in order to minister. Now, sometimes what's said is that, we don't see the women being commissioned to do anything. We don't see the women being sent out to minister, to heal, to proclaim the kingdom of God as the male disciples were, or as the 12 were. I'll put it like that, as the 12 were. But based upon the work of Professor Joan Taylor, we looked at and we explored the evidence and the possibility and the evidence that when it says in the Gospels that Jesus sent out the disciples 2 by 2, duo by duo, this refers to male and female going out together. So by the way, this would be a functional equality, that they're going out there together to minister. And again, this is based upon the work of scholar and professor Dr. Joan Taylor. We saw last week that male and females going out together to minister was also affirmed by Paul. Let me stop there for a second. So you could go back and look at the, not last week's, but the week before last, message number 45, where I lay out all the information about duo. Dr. Joan Taylor said that this is very possibly a Semitic idiom, a Hebraic or Aramaic idiom that points back to, and it is utilized in the Septuagint when it talks about Noah's Ark and the animals going in 2 by 2, that it always refers to male and female pairings. That when we look in the Dead Sea Scrolls, when the Dead Sea Scrolls make use of, and they're talking about why polygamy is not allowed, one of the scriptures they utilize is the passage that deals with Noah's Ark and the animals going in 2 by 2, and they say it's male and female. So whenever duo is utilized, which is how the Septuagint reads the Genesis passage that deals with the animals going in, it says also in Genesis duo, when it says that Jesus is sending the disciples out 2 by 2, duo, that phrase always harkens back to male and female parents. So I laid out all of the evidence for that. Go back, listen to message number 45, where I talk about this. Now, we also saw last week that male and females going out together to minister was also affirmed by Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 5. So if you got your Bible, turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. We're going to look at that again real quick. I covered this in detail last time. Just going to look at it real quickly. Paul says in verse 1, am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Haven't I seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If I am not an apostle to others, yet doubtless I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. Verse 3, my defense to those who examine me is this. Paul was defending his apostleship. Do we have no right to eat and drink? Do we have no right to take along a believing wife, as do also the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas? So notice Paul says, don't we have the right to take along a believing wife? Now, the word believing wife, actually in Greek, the word believing there is not it's not from the pistis word group that has to do with faith or believing. It's actually the word adelphe, which means sister. Okay, so literally when Paul says here that my New King James translates it as believing wife, it is really in Greek, it is sister wife, or it is sister woman, because the word there for wife, gune, in Greek could also mean simply woman. So Paul is either talking about the wives of some of the apostles, or that there were women, that definitely there were women, sister wives or sister women, who were going out with the apostles. And they were going out and they were ministering. Matter of fact, Dr. Islari Ramali, in an article that she wrote for a book called Patterns of Women Leadership in Early Christianity, She wrote an article called Colleagues of Apostles, Presbyters, and Bishops. She states that in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 5, that when Paul says that, do we have no right to take along a sister wife, that this, or sister woman, this could refer to a female apostle, a woman who was a sister in the faith, which is why some translation writes it as a believing wife, because it's a sister in the faith. So what we have here is that Dr. Romali is saying that this could refer to a female apostle. Now, we're going to be getting more into that, so stay with me. It'll probably be tomorrow when we do our service tomorrow. I'll be getting more into were these women apostles, okay? We'll talk about that. And was Junia an apostle? We'll talk about that. Probably not tomorrow. Junia is going to take a little bit of work to do. We may do that in a whole, we probably will do that in a whole separate section. But again, Dr. Romali states that in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, these sister wives or sister women could refer to a female apostle or a woman who was a sister in the faith. It could refer to a spouse. Definitely, that shows the context here probably links to that. And what she does is she cites several ancient commentators. She cites Clement of Alexandria. She cites Augustine, and another commentator named Ambrosiaster, and Isidore of Pelusium. These were all ancient commentators, and Ambrosiaster was an unknown commentator. Isidore of Pelusium, he lived during the 4th and 5th century. Clement, he lived around in the 2nd century. So these were ancient commentators on the scripture, Clement of Alexandria being the earliest one that we're citing here. And this is what she says about Clement of Alexandria and how he viewed 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 5. Actually, this is a quote from one of his writings. It's called Stromata 3, 6, and 53. It says, even Paul, this is what Clement of Alexandria said. This is his commentary on 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 5. Even Paul did not hesitate in one letter to address his consort. Let me say again that there are some who believe Paul was married at one point, that his wife either may have died or may have had a divorce. There are those who believe that. There are those who don't. But evidently, Clement of Alexandria believed Paul could have been married. So he says, even Paul did not hesitate in one letter to address his consort. The only reason why he did not take her about with him was that it would have been an inconvenience for his ministry. Accordingly, he says in a letter, have we not a right to take about with us a wife that is a sister like the other apostles? But the latter, in accordance with their particular ministry, the other apostles, they devoted themselves to preaching without any distraction and took their wives with them, not as women with whom they had marriage relations, but as sisters, that they might be their fellow ministers in dealing with housewives. It was through them that the Lord's teaching penetrated also the women's quarters without any scandal being aroused. Now, again, we covered this in lesson number 45, but what he's saying here is that from his point of view, Clement, speaking in this probably late 2nd century, early 3rd century, his view is that the apostles did take along their wives, but they did not function as husband and wives, that they were celibate at least during the time when they were traveling. So, and that the women were functioning as fellow ministers. Now, a friend of mine, he said, a friend of mine, Dr. Roy, not Dr. Roy, but a friend of mine, friend and scholar, Roy Blizzard III, Roy, if you're watching, thank you for the note that you sent me, brought up the fact that, this is Clement of Alexandria. He's a Greek. He's thinking this way, though I looked up Clement, did a little bit of research. He did have a high view of marriage. But this is what Clement said, that they were celibate. The text doesn't actually say this. This is Clement's view, that they were celibate when they were traveling. We don't know if they really were, but here's the point. The reason I'm quoting this is because Clement is bringing out that the women traveled with their husbands as fellow ministers. He saw them. Now you have to understand, when Clement is writing, this is a patriarchal culture, and many, if not most, of the ancient patristic fathers had very little view of women. But he sees the women traveling with the apostles as being fellow ministers with them. This is why Dr. Romali said that these women could refer to female apostles, or a female apostle, a woman who was a sister in the faith. Now, again, Clement of Alexandria sees these as the wives of the apostles, but they are celibate when they're traveling, so that they can function as ministers, so that the women could also minister as they're going into different homes. They could go into the women's quarters where the women would be, so it wouldn't seem improper or that there was something going on by having these men go into the women's quarters. So they had women who would along with them. But what this shows us, what this demonstrates from 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 5, is that there were those, again, that pairing of men and women going together to minister. According to Augustine and Ambrosiaster, the women, they taught, these ancient commentators taught, the women who traveled with the disciples were not their wives. And Isidore of Pelusium translated wives, again, Gune in Greek, as woman, not wife. So there were some ancient commentators who said, no, this was not their women. These were just sisters going along, which means these sisters were also commissioned by the Lord to go along with these men in order to minister. Again, giving some credence to the idea of what Dr. Joan Taylor said, that 2 by 2, duo, refers to men and women traveling together in order to minister. That the female disciples of Jesus, we know he had female disciples based upon Luke chapter 8, verse 1 through 3, among other passages, that these, when Jesus sends out the 12, when Jesus sends out the 70 or the 72, 2 by 2, there were females among them also ministering, proclaiming the kingdom. Okay, doing the work that the disciples were told to do. So they were going out there healing, preaching the kingdom, declaring the kingdom of God is at hand, and they're healing the sick, they're casting out devils. The women were also doing this together. Okay, so again, some of the ancient commentators also saw women as traveling with the disciples, apostles, as fellow workers, as ministers, and I would say, as we're going to be looking at later, also as apostles themselves. And again, the main point here is that the women were seen as fellow ministers. Okay, so even some of the ancient commentators looked upon it this way. So it was a practice in the early church for ministers or apostles to travel together and to work in pairs. Again, we saw this last week. But I was listening to a lecture that I've heard several times already. I've listened to it as a great lecture by a scholar named Dr. Judith Gundry. She has on YouTube, there's a lecture that she does called Holy in Body and Spirit, the Lordship of Christ and Gender Roles in the Pauline's Epistles. You can find this on YouTube. Again, it's called Holy in Body and Spirit, the Lordship of Christ and Gender Roles in the Pauline's Epistles. And in that lecture, she states that the purpose for traveling with an associate was so that the apostolic message or preaching could, quote, it could be confirmed by a second authorized opinion, end quote. So this is what Dr. Judith Gundry says, that the reason you travel with an associate was so that the apostolic message or preaching could, quote, be confirmed by a second authorized opinion. And she cites a scholar by the name of Joachim Jeremias as tracing this back to the Jewish practice of sending people in pairs, which was based upon the Torah passage that Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 15. There's a passage in Deuteronomy 19:15. If you got your Bible, I want you to turn there. We're going to read it. Deuteronomy chapter 19, and we're going to look at verse 15. So the idea of sending out 2 by 2, the idea here that Jesus didn't make this up. This was actually a Jewish practice of sending out 2 by 2 as a confirming witness. And where it comes from is Deuteronomy chapter 19 and verse 15, which we're going to read. And it says this: one witness shall not rise against a man concerning any inquiry or any sin that he commits. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, the matter shall be established. And the word matter there can be translated also as word. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, the word shall be established. So according to Dr. Judith Gundry, who traces this back from the research of Joachim Jeremias, this was a Jewish practice of sending people in pairs based upon the Torah passage. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word, every matter shall be established. Okay, we see Jesus actually utilizing this in his teaching. Go to John chapter 8, and we're going to look at verse 14. John chapter 8, verse 14. Jesus states this principle again. He utilizes it where his self is concerned. John chapter 8. Let's look at verse 14. It says, let's start at verse 13. It says, the Pharisee said to Jesus, you bear witness of yourself. Your witness is not true. Now, why are they saying his witness is not true? They said, because you bear witness of yourself. In order for a witness to be established as true, how many do we need? Two. They said, Jesus, you're bearing witness of yourself. You're only one, so your witness is not true. They're basing this off of, they're going off of the passage in Deuteronomy 19:15 that we just read. How does Jesus answer? Jesus answered and said to them, I think this is masterful. Even if I bear witness of myself, my witness is true. For I know where I came from and where I'm going, but you do not know where I come from and where I'm going. You judge according to the flesh. I judge no one. And yet if I do judge, my judgment is true, for I am not alone, but I am with the Father who sent me. It is also written in your law that the testimony of two men is true. We just read it, Deuteronomy 19:15. I am the one who bears witness of myself, that's one, and the Father who sent me bears witness of me. That's two. So we see Jesus applying the same principle that two witnesses are needed in order to establish that something is true. Paul also uses this in 2 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 1, where he says to the Corinthians, he's coming to them a second time in order to confirm what he said. And he quotes Deuteronomy 19:15, as it is written in the mouth of two or three witnesses, let every word be established. So Paul uses this, Jesus uses this. This was an established principle. And Dr. Gundry, citing Joachim Jeremias, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, that this is a Jewish practice. It was a Jewish practice of sending people in pairs. This is why you see often the Apostle Paul, he's traveling with Barnabas. So Paul and Barnabas, or Paul and Silas, or Paul and Timothy, they're traveling together in pairs. Now, somebody say, well, Mike, if they're traveling together in pairs, we covered this. When it says they're sending out duo, couldn't that just be men? Well, as we said before, when the term duo, whenever it is used, when we see it in the Hebrew text, when we see it in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's always referring to male and female pairings, okay? So while pairs can be sent out, like the Bible talks about Paul and Silas, Paul and Barnabas, Paul and Timothy, it never uses the term duo where they are concerned. We only have it used in the Gospels. And whenever that term is used, if it is, and I believe it is, an Aramaic or Semitic idiom, it refers to the pairing of male and female. So once again, we see the concept of 2 by 2 being sent out, that is accurate. That is not a strange thing for two people to be sent out as a confirming witness. That's not strange. But also, this would mean that if duo is referring to male and female, the female disciples of Jesus are also being sent out with him. Now, one of the things I want to bring out real quick is what, again, my friend and scholar Roy Blizzard III, he wrote to me, I think he heard my earlier message, and he pointed out that even though they were sent out 2 by 2, it's not necessarily true that the men and the women were sent out by themselves. You have one man, one woman, and they're traveling alone. They could travel together in herds. In other words, all of the 2 by 2, all of them together, let's say there's 70 of them, it's 2 by 2. So if you're thinking that if there's 70, let's say there's 70 men and women, or if there's 70 and there's 2 by 2, all of these people are traveling together from different towns. And when Roy wrote that, I went, oh, that's actually a good point. And it's true, because travel in the first century was pretty dangerous, okay? And so it was safer to travel together, as Roy said, in herds or in large groups, because you were in danger of bandits, you were in danger of being robbed, you were in danger of being killed. So it wasn't, it was not, and I agree with Roy on this, it probably was not that they were going out there by themselves. And again, Roy, thank you for bringing that out so I can emphasize it here. It's not that a one man and one woman were going out. That would actually be kind of dangerous, and that could be suspect. But you have these groups traveling together from town to town, and probably they're going to different people's homes, and they are ministering to them. You have men and women going into these different homes and ministering to the families that are there, in order to make sure that there's nothing improper, or it causes it to look, it will help it to look like there is nothing improper going on. So it does away with any sense of impropriety is happening or taking place. Okay, as a matter of fact, let me read to you something. I did a little bit more research, as always. That's why, see, when you watch these things, I come back and do it again, I usually add bonus material. Okay, so I went and did some research. I found a book called there's a book called The Impact of Mobility and Migration in the Roman Empire by Margherita Carucci. And this is chapter 10 of the book, The Impact of Mobility and Migration in the Roman Empire. The chapter is entitled The Dangers of Female Mobility in Roman Times. And she writes, quote, in a letter dated to 296, probably 296 AD, Planiscos asked his wife, Politogena, to visit him, hope I'm pronouncing those names right, and to visit him and to bring certain items to him in Coptus. And he says, quote, and when you come, this is his writing to her, when you come, bring 10 fleeces of wool, 6 jars of olives, 4 jars of honey wine, and my shield, only the new one, and my helmet. Bring also my lances. Bring also the fittings of the tent. If you find an opportunity, come here with good men. Notice that. If you find an opportunity, come here with good men. Let none of us come with you. Bring all your clothing when you come. Bring your gold ornaments with you on the trip, but do not wear them on the boat. Why? Because if people seeing you wearing gold ornaments, you're going to get your chains snatched. Okay? So the idea was you're inviting trouble if you do this. But notice he says to her, if you find an opportunity, come here with good men. And what Dr. Carucci says is the letter seems to suggest that a woman may be safe on travels if she is accompanied by good men and does not display her jewelry on the way. So if she is being accompanied by good men, she says she may be safe on her travels if she is accompanied by good men. So once again, we see this idea that they are traveling together, they're probably traveling together in groups. Some people will say, well, it would be unsafe for the women. But if they're all traveling together, men and women, the men, of course, would be a protection for the women. So once again, it shows that there is this idea that this could take place. This could happen with men and women traveling together, as my friend and scholar Roy Blizzard III says, in a herd, in order to make sure that, number one, there is no sense of impropriety, and number two, the women are being protected, and they're protecting each other by being in large groups. Okay, so just wanted to make sure that I bring that out. Now, and by the way, go back over to Luke chapter 8 again, and look at verse 1. I just want to point out something about the groups. It says, now early, no, that's in John. Go back to Luke chapter 8. Where's Luke at? Here we go. Luke chapter 8. How did Jesus and his team travel, his disciples? It says in Luke 8:1, now it came to pass afterward that he went through every city and village, preaching and bringing the glad tidings of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, and certain women were with him who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary called Magdalene, out of whom he had come 7 demons. Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward, and Susanna, and many others who provided for him from their substance. So in other words, Jesus has a crowd, or as my friend Roy says, there is a herd that's following Jesus. There's a great multitude there's a multitude of people, a lot of people following Jesus. So they're not alone, they're working together, they're following him, walking with each other as they're going from town to town, and Jesus is ministering. And then when he sends them out, he sends them out 12, duo, 2 by 2, and then he sends them out the 70 or the 72, 2 by 2. So there's always this crowd traveling together. This provides safety for everyone involved. Now, in saying that, there are those who would push back on this and argue against women being sent out with men, and argue against women being seen as apostles. And I want to start dealing with this more specifically. Also, too, a friend of mine, Charles Starkey, Charles, if you're watching this, you're part of the reason why I brought this up, because I thought you made a great point. Charles was not offering an objection. He asked a question, and that was, wouldn't some see women traveling with men who are not their relatives and ministering to others? Wouldn't that be seen as scandalous in the first century world? Wouldn't that be seen as scandalous if you got these women traveling with men who are not their relatives? That's a good question. And there are some who will use this as an objection to say, no, these women would not be leaders. They would not be disciples because they would be traveling with men. This would go against first century custom and tradition. So there are some who see this as a reason, and they present this as a reason why Jesus did not choose women to be among the 12 and thus a leader. We're going to be dealing with that probably tomorrow. In other words, we're going to be dealing with, okay, Jesus chose 12, the 12 disciples. They were all men. Does this mean that therefore women were not among the leadership? Going to deal with that, I believe, tomorrow. Okay, but we're going to look at first what this has been considered scandalous and therefore it not be done, or that these women really were not going out as ministers, that this would push against the duo ideas that, well, no, this would be seen as scandalous. Well, while there is the possibility of it being scandalous to some, it is not necessarily without precedent in the first century world. There's something similar going on in the first century world where there were women studying together, studying the Torah together, like Jesus' female disciples, with other men. Okay, there were groups who had females who studied with men. So as we studied in an earlier session, in the Greco-Roman world, there were Greco-Roman philosophers like Musonius Rufus, Plutarch, Neo-Pythagorean philosophers who had female disciples who studied alongside men. In one of our earlier sessions, we've talked about that. There were philosophers in the Greco-Roman world who had female disciples. Philo, who was a Hellenistic Jew and an author, he writes about a group of people known as the Therapeutae, who had both men and women who studied the Torah and lived together in a commune by a lake. I believe it was called the Mariatic Lake. They lived together, kind of like a commune, and they studied the Torah together. He writes about this in a work, in his work known as in a work called On the Contemplative Life. So Philo writes about this in a work. He writes about the Therapeutae in a work called On the Contemplative Life. Okay, so there were women who were studying in this group. Okay, according to Philo, both the men and the women were celibate, and when they came together to hear a teaching, there was a divider between the men and the women. Okay, so they were segregated. It was a divider in the room that was built up. It didn't quite reach the ceiling, but it was built up high to keep the men and the women segregated. Even though they all studied together, they studied together at this commune. When they would come together, they were segregated from each other. Now, there are some people like, I believe Dr. Lynn Kohik, she questions whether or not this actually happened because Philo wants to present them in a very positive light. Philo, I think Dr. Lynn Kohik said that Philo also talks about synagogues having a barrier separating the men from the women, and the archaeology just doesn't support that. There has been no synagogue found in the first century where there is a divider separating the men from the women. So could it be that Philo was saying this because he wanted to present these women as virtuous? Could be, because this is one of the things that we're going to see Philo was seeking to do. But when these people ate together, so when they came together to study, there was a divider, and the women could hear the voice, the voice of the teacher that was in the room there, but they were just divided. But however, there were certain times when they would come together to eat, and when they would come together to eat, there was no divider, there was no segregation. Let me read to you from this book here, Women in the World of the Earliest Christians by Dr. Lynn Kohik. She writes about the Therapeutae in the book, and she says in the book, in one significant departure from their usual clothing, each community member dons snow white raiment, like priests for their 7th week community celebration, the Sabbath of Sabbaths. So on the Sabbath of Sabbath, they would wear a different type of clothing. Then she says, quote, both men and women eat from a special table that symbolizes the table of the showbread of the temple. Philo includes that women are priests in that their souls are purified and their bodies are transcendent, just like their male counterparts. The meal celebrates the members' victory of self-control as they rejoice in their sanctuary. No wall is necessary to separate men from women, for all present are purified souls who have shed, at least for the moment, the restrictions of the body. The therapeutics, both men and women, symbolically understood as priests, worshiping before God, celebrate throughout the night with hymns and dancing. Unlike the seventh-day meal, wherein gender distinctions play an important role in dividing space, in the Sabbath of Sabbath festival, gender distinctions are minimized while the dichotomy between soul and body is exploited. For this day at least, the therapeutides, this is what the women, the female therapeutae were called, they celebrate as equals with their brothers. So on the Sabbath of Sabbath festival, they celebrate with their brothers as equals. They There is no separation between them, and they are all thought of as priests worshiping the Lord, singing hymns to him throughout the night. These are men and women doing this together. Now, this was in Alexandria of Egypt. Okay, so these were Jews, Hellenistic Jews, studying in Alexandria of Egypt. They were studying the Torah using allegory methods, which was Philo's favorite way of studying the Torah. So these Jews were not in Jerusalem. I want to be clear about that. They were in Alexandria of Egypt. But the reason I bring it out is because, again, you did have females, just like you had female students of philosophy. You have these women studying the Torah, even though they're doing an allegorical method. And these are probably well-to-do women. Usually, if you are being educated as a female, you're learning to read, you're learning to write, probably you come from a well-to-do family. At least they have enough money where they can support you in being able to do that. But these women have left all of that behind. They are celibate, and they are studying the Torah utilizing an allegorical method, which is Philo's favorite way of studying. The reason I bring this up again is to show that it is not outside of, it's not so totally strange to think that you've got men and women studying together. Now, Philo speaks very highly and with great respect of this group and of the women who lived and studied among them. There is a book called Jewish Women Philosophers of First Century Alexandria. Philo's Therapeutae Reconsidered is by Dr. Joan Taylor again. This is where I got most of my information when I was studying about the Therapeutae. And she writes that Philo portrays the female members of the Therapeutae as, quote, having the same, now notice this, they have the same zeal and purpose as the men, and he portrays them as being very modest, like elderly virgins. So number one, he wants to show that these women, like the men, have the same zeal and purpose to do what? To study the Torah. So they're like the men. You have to understand, in the ancient world, when women are being spoken of being like men, not that they are men, but they are like men, that they're seen as being very virtuous. If they show what would be considered back then manly virtues, or they do manly deeds, depending on what the deeds are, then they're seen as, quote, manly, and they are seen as virtuous. They're seen as, they're accepted, they're okay. Well, Philo says here that these female members of the Therapeutae, they have the same zeal and purpose as the men. And he portrays them as being very modest or virtuous, like elderly virgins. So an elderly virgin, someone who had remained a virgin and now they were older, in the first century Greco-Roman world, they would have been seen as virtuous. So what does Philo says? That these people are portrayed, these female Therapeutae are portrayed like elderly virgins. They are completely proper, modest, and chaste. They are the models of femininity, end quote. This is how Philo portrays the female members of the Therapeutae. He also refers to them as being conceptually domestic, as virgin matrons in the household of perfect philosophy. Now, what is that talking about? Well, in the first century world, a woman was seen as virtuous if she took care of the home. She was domestic. She stayed at home. She took care of the home. She took care of the family. She would be seen as virtuous. Now, these women have left their homes and they have moved to basically what we would call today a commune. They've left home, they've left family, and they are studying Torah. Now, most of them are either, some scholars will say they're probably well-to-do. They're either virgins, so they didn't have families in the sense of husbands and children, or they are widows, and they are older, and so they've moved to this commune and they're studying. Philo says that they are conceptually domestic, meaning that they are in principle domestic because they are virgin matrons in the household of perfect philosophy, and they're giving birth to philosophical ideas. They're studying, they're getting insight and revelation, and that is basically, in his thinking, their children. So he sees them as conceptually domestic, not literally domestic, but ideally they're domestic. In terms of principle, they are domestic. Why is Philo trying to do his best to show that these women are virtuous? Because he wants to prevent the Therapeutae from the female Therapeutae as being seen as scandalous So the way he does this, the way he tries to prevent them from being seen as there's something improper going on, is that he presents them as exceptional women of virtue. These are women of virtue, and he speaks of them in virtuous ways. This way, it prevents the entire commune itself, which he favors, he thinks of very highly. They're utilizing his favorite method of interpretation, allegory. He doesn't want them to be seen in a scandalous light. But how does he talk about these men and women living together? Because that could be seen as scandalous. What does he do? He does his very best to show that these women are virtuous. He talks about them in virtuous ways. He says that they have the same zeal and purpose as the men, that they are very modest, like elderly virgins. They are completely proper, modest, chaste. They are the model of femininity. They are conceptually domestic. They are virgin matrons in the household of perfect philosophy. And they have left their households, quote, to live an ascetic life of few possessions, which among many groups that would have been seen as being virtuous. They've given up their possessions, they live an ascetic life, and they do that for the study of the Torah, okay? So he is presenting them as virtuous, and by presenting them as virtuous, this downplays the idea that something improper is going on. This downplays the idea that it displays the idea that something scandalous is happening because you've got these men and these women living together at this lake, okay? So this is what he's doing. So though they are not in normal homes and living with men, though they're not in normal homes and though they are living with men, not their family, they are seen as conceptually domestic and matrons in the household of philosophy. The household being the therapeutic school and the allegory study of Torah. So they are in a household. It's the household of the study of Torah. Now, why is that important? Dr. Lynn Kohik, in her book, Women in the World of Earliest Christianity, has this to say about thinking about women and men studying together. She talks about it within the concept of Greco-Roman philosophy. And this is what she says in her book. She says, the primary reason many men believe female philosophers were promiscuous centered on the type of education necessary for achieving proficiency in philosophy. In most cases, the, quote, school was not part of public space such as the marketplace or temple. Where was the school held? It was held in a private venue, and its members viewed one another as a community, even as family, okay? And then she goes on to say, the metaphor of being a community of family, this metaphor cut both ways for women. For rhetorical purposes, in presenting a philosophical school as a private group or family, a woman's modesty could be preserved much as it was in her own home. Now, there's much more that we're going to be coming back to later when we talk about this, but the idea here again is that she talks about the fact that even though the school was not part of public space, and even though it was held in a private venue, one of the ways that they got around again from this being looking too scandalous was by presenting the philosophical school as a private group or a family. This way, a woman's modesty or virtue would be preserved because she was with her community, she was with her new family, okay? So this is one of the ways to preserve her virtue. So again, you have to keep in mind that Judaism in the first century could be and was thought of as a school of philosophy. And so these groups would have been seen as a community, or these groups would have been seen as a family. They among the Essenes, we know that among the Essenes, it looks like there were also women who were in the Essenes group, not necessarily their wives, but there were women that were part of the Dead Sea community, because they did some excavation and they found these graves where there were men and women bones buried there. So there were women there also. But again, they were seen as a community. They were seen as a family. So that's another evidence from the first century that this was not necessarily without precedent, that women could be studying the Torah along with the men. Okay, so we see it with the Essenes or the Dead Sea community. We also see it with the Therapeutae. Okay, and Greco-Roman philosophers spoke of their schools as a family or a private group. The Therapeutae, they would have been seen as a community, possibly as a family. So the reason I give you all that background and to lay that all out, again, it's the idea that, well, would this have been seen as scandalous? Some people could have seen it as scandalous, but we had other groups in the first century who were functioning with men and women studying together, philosophical schools, the Therapeutae in Egypt, Alexandria, Egypt, and the way the suggestion of impropriety was played down was by demonstrating that the group, the men and especially the women, were virtuous. Keep in mind that women were seen as dangerous within the first century, but these women that Philo are talking about, they are portrayed as being virtuous. So by portraying them as being virtuous, it downplays the idea that something scandalous, something improper was going on. Now, again, I say this because when we look at the female disciples of Jesus, I believe the Gospels, the female disciples of Jesus are also presented as women of virtue. Even, I would say, exceptional virtue. They are portrayed as women of virtue. And we can miss this as if we don't catch the clues, but they're seen as virtue, which downplays the idea that there's something improper going on. Okay? Number one, if you go back to Luke chapter 8, verse 1, Luke chapter 8, and it says, let's look at verse 2. And certain women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities, Mary, called Magdalene, out of whom had come 7 demons, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward, and Susanna, and many others who provided for him from their substance. So Jesus had a lot of females. We have 3 of them named here, and then there were many others. So it was Mary, Joanna, Susanna, and many others who followed Jesus. What were they doing? They were providing for him out of their substance. So they were supporting their rabbi. They were supporting their teacher. They are engaged in honorable service, which is supporting Jesus out of their own possessions. This would have been seen as an honorable act. So they are engaged in honorable service. So this would show that they are virtuous women. Okay. Also, I think it is significant that 3 of the women are specifically named. We have Mary being named. Mary called Magdalene. We have Joanna or Magdalene. I don't know if it's Magdalene or Magdalene. I've heard both. But Mary called Magdalene. Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward, and Susanna. Why name these women? I would suggest that they're being named because they were known in the first century, that these were 3 known names, or else why name them? So they're naming women who are probably, by this time period, they are well known within the church. In the church, these are women of honor. These are women of virtue. And very possibly they were known for their service. They were known for their virtue. And this is why Luke is naming them. So this is another reason why I believe these women are being portrayed as virtuous. In Luke chapter 10, verse 42, the story about Mary and Martha. Mary, Jesus' disciple, is commended by Jesus for choosing to study Torah rather than serving him a meal at that particular time. She chooses the study of Torah over the duties that were regularly expected of women. Now, again, she did this for just a period of time. It's not that Mary said, oh, I'm never going to serve a meal again. But at that moment, at that time, she chose to study at the feet of Jesus. And Jesus, as his disciple, Jesus commends her for this. Now, again, as I said before, when I taught on this doesn't mean that Jesus, in affirming Mary's choice to study the Torah, overdoing the domestic chore in that moment of serving him a meal, that he's putting down Martha. Remember I said, and there are some people who look upon it that, well, why is Jesus putting down Martha? Because she's serving. But we have to remember again that this is a culture where the study of Torah takes priority over other things. As I shared with you in an earlier session, I read to you a quote from Every Man's Talmud where it talks about that the study of Torah takes precedence over the building of the temple. The study of Torah takes precedence over the building of the temple. There is another rabbinic quote that I read you where it talks about the study of Torah takes precedence over one's community obligations. So both for men and women, the study of Torah was seen as more important than anything else. It's not that you completely dispense with other things, but that the study of Torah took precedence. And we see this with Jesus. When there are those that Jesus called to be his disciple, there's one person who said, let me first go bury my family member, and Jesus said, let the dead bury the dead. Again, the study of Torah takes precedence over other things. Okay, there was one person that Jesus called, and they gave another excuses why they couldn't follow him right now. And Jesus said, anyone setting their hand to the plow and looking back is not fit for the kingdom of heaven, which tells us being his disciple and the study of Torah was extremely important to Jesus. It does not mean that necessarily other family obligations were kicked out of the window or kicked out of one's life and one never dealt with their family again. But when Jesus says, if anyone wants to be my disciple, he must hate father and mother and wife and children, or as Matthew puts it, he must love me above all of these things. Being his disciple, studying with him, takes precedent over everything else. Remember when someone said to Jesus, blessed is the breast that gave you suckle? And Jesus said, yea, rather blessed are the ones who hear the will of God and do it. Again, the precedent or the study of Torah and the doing of Torah takes precedent over something that is important. He didn't say, yeah, ladies, don't feed your children. He's saying what's even more important than that, as important as that is, what's even more important. I believe it's kind of like a syncresis, which is a method of comparing things. You compare something that's good. You compare two things together. You take something that's good and you compare it to something else so that something else is the better. So you are comparing the good with the better. You always and you want to amplify the thing that's even better, so you compare it to something good. You don't compare it to something bad. You take what is good, and you take the thing that's even, I'm going to use improper English, you take what's even gooder and you compare the two so that what is gooder gets amplified. Jesus, in one sense, I believe what he's saying is, look, the feeding of children is important, but even more important than that is the studying the doing of God's words. He's amplifying that. Not necessarily saying, and I don't think he's saying, don't feed your children, okay? Don't feed your children and make this, if it's time to feed, like I have a grandchild who's being breastfed. I tell my daughter, no, not time to breastfeed the child. You must study the Torah. That's even more important. No. It's not what's being said. It's amplifying one over the other. And Jesus said to Mary and to Martha, Mary has chosen that part which is good, which shall not be taken from her. He's amplifying the study of Torah, being his disciple, sitting at his feet and studying. And I believe that was an invitation to Martha to come and study Torah with him, saying basically, Martha, set that aside for a while, come study Torah, and then you can go back to that. That's my view and that's my take on it. But again, what Jesus is showing in Luke chapter 10 is that Mary is virtuous because she chooses to study the Torah. It's showing that she is exalting the study of Torah over everything else. That would present her and put her in a virtuous life. She chooses the study of Torah over duties that were regularly expected of women. Okay, so rather than her study being cast as a dishonorable behavior, which it could have been, hey, Mary, you're not doing your duty as a woman, Jesus shows her choice to be honorable, and he honors her for her choice. Again, his female disciples are being presented as virtuous. Here are some other examples real quick. The Syrophoenician woman that we've already talked about in a previous study. Go back and read that. I love that study. It's been one of my favorite studies so far. The Syrophoenician woman is also presented as virtuous. She is shown as observing the Torah concerning not wasting food. When Jesus says to her, it is not meet to take the children's bread and cast it to dogs. And the woman says, but even the little dogs get the crumbs that fall from the children's table. This deals with the Jewish concept known as Bal Tashchit, which is not destroying or wasting things unnecessarily. Specifically, can refer to not wasting food. Okay, if you throw bread to dogs are unclean. If you throw food that are meant for human beings, you throw it to the dogs, you are, in that time period, in that culture, you are wasting food. But as we said in the earlier study when we talked about this, crumbs that are smaller than the size of an olive, those are for the animals. It is good for them. So this woman shows her understanding of the Torah. She shows her commitment to the Torah. She shows that she understands the teachings where that is concerned. And Jesus says to her, woman, great is your faith. Great is your faith. In him Could be talking about him, but I believe he's talking about her faithfulness to the Torah, to the teaching of Torah, and what Jesus and what Luke does in Luke chapter, what Matthew does, what Matthew does in Matthew chapter 15 is he is contrasting the faithfulness of this woman to the unfaithfulness of the scribes and Pharisees. Go over to Matthew chapter 15. Again, we talked about this before. Just want to look at it real quick. Matthew chapter 15. And keep in mind, folks, what I'm saying here is that Jesus, what the Gospels are doing, they're showing that Jesus' female disciples are virtuous, which downplays the idea that something scandalous is going along. Just like Philo portrays the female therapeutae as being virtuous, throughout the Gospels, Jesus' female disciples are also shown to be virtuous women. In Matthew chapter 15, we have the story of the Syrophoenician woman who comes to Jesus. He commends her for her faithfulness to the Torah. But this is set in contrast to the unfaithfulness of the scribes and Pharisees to the Torah. In Matthew chapter 15, verse 1, then the scribes and Pharisees who were from Jerusalem came to Jesus. Now notice, these are scribes and Pharisees who come from Jerusalem, the holy city. They should be obedient to the Torah. I believe Matthew is mentioning this specifically. One of the things you have to understand, especially about the book of Matthew, many scholars have brought out that Matthew is written to show the faithfulness of Jesus' followers to the Torah. There are many scholars who believe that by this time it was written that there was conflict between some of Jesus' followers and those that were not Jesus' followers within the Jewish community, and that what Matthew is at pains to show is that Jesus' followers are truly observant, they are truly faithful and followers of the Torah. Part of this can be seen in something that Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5 when he says, I have not come to destroy the Torah, but to fulfill it. The word destroy is a rabbinic idiom, which means to misinterpret the Torah in such a way that you cause others to disobey it. To fulfill is another rabbinic idiom. I learned this years ago from my teachers, Dr. Roy Blizzard, David Bivin, Dr. Roy Blizzard, Shumel Safrai, and others who taught me the Jewish roots of the Christianity, either in person or through their literature. They taught that to fulfill the Torah means to interpret it correctly and to cause people to obey it. What Jesus does here is show that these scribes and Pharisees, they're destroying the Torah. But Jesus said, I've not come to destroy the Torah. Why would he say that? Probably because there were those who were saying, hey, you are destroying the Torah, you are misinterpreting it, and you're causing others to misinterpret it. We see this here in Matthew 15. Then the scribes and the Pharisees who were from Jerusalem came to Jesus saying, why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread. Now, two things. Number one, when they're talking about the tradition of the elders, they're talking about what's known as the oral Torah, the Torah Shabbat al-Peh, the Torah from the mouth. Okay, this is the teachings, the traditions of the fathers. But the traditions of the fathers are interpretations of the written text. So what they are saying is that they have the right interpretation. Jesus' disciples have the wrong interpretation, or by saying your disciples do not wash their hands when they eat bread, they're implying Jesus as a teacher, you are teaching the Torah wrong. You are misinterpreting the Torah wrong to your disciples and causing them to disobey it. They're challenging him as a teacher. And they're saying, you are teaching the Torah wrong. What does Jesus say to them? He answered and said to them, why do you also transgress the commandments of God because of your tradition? For God commanded, saying, honor your father and mother, and he who curses father and mother, let him be put to death. But you say, whoever says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me is a gift of God, then he need not honor his father and mother. In case you didn't know, honor father and mother doesn't simply mean I respect you. It also means within that time period, the meaning of honor your father and mother means you take care of your mother and father financially. You provide for them. Jesus is saying you are teaching people to get around that. You scribes and Pharisees from Jerusalem, you are teaching people to get around. What is he saying? You are misinterpreting. You are destroying the Torah, not me. He says you are. Then he goes on to say, thus you have made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition. Hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy about you, saying, these people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me, and in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. Now, what Jesus is doing is contrasting the faithfulness of the Syrophoenician or Canaanite woman to the Torah with her obedience to the teaching of the Torah, that you do not waste food, with the unfaithfulness of the scribes and Pharisees to the Torah of God. And as a matter of fact, they even bring up about food being defiled. How do we know? Because they said, your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders, for they do not wash their hands when they eat bread. Meaning what? If their hands are not washed, then their hands are defiled or unclean. If they touch the bread becomes unclean. If the bread becomes unclean, they have to throw it away. That's wasting food. Okay? These two rabbinic arguments are being presented within the same chapter, but what Jesus is saying is, it is not you who are faithful. You disregard the commandments of God. And then later on, he talks to that the proselyte woman. I believe that the Syrophoenician Canaanite woman, she was a proselyte to Judaism, as we taught in an earlier session, and that he's saying, hey, you have been faithful to the Torah because you understand not to waste food. You understand how it goes. Because Jesus said, you don't throw the children's bread to the dogs, which is a waste of food. She says, yes, but the children get the crumbs that are smaller than, according to the Berachot 52b, they get the crumbs that are smaller than an olive. That food goes to the animals. She understood the Torah. She understood the rabbinic teaching. She was faithful to it. Jesus calls her faithful. He honors her and shows her to be virtuous and sets her virtue of faithfulness in contrast to the unfaithfulness, the vice of unfaithfulness of the scribes and Pharisees who are teaching people to disobey the Torah. Here you got a Gentile proselyte who's obeying the Torah, and you've got men from Jerusalem, scribes and Pharisees, not all scribes and Pharisees, just the one that Jesus was dealing with, that they are being unfaithful to Torah and teaching other people to be unfaithful to Torah. So once again, we see Jesus' disciples, specifically a female disciple. I believe she became a female disciple of Jesus. She is faithful. She is being shown as virtuous. Okay, so we see this where she is concerned. And let me show you one more. Turn to Matthew chapter 26. Matthew chapter 26. And again, the idea here is that would have been scandalous. I believe that what the Gospels do to play down any sense of impropriety is that they show that Jesus' female disciples are virtuous. They are not dangerous. They are not to be scared of. They are not women who are promiscuous. These are virtuous women. Matthew chapter 26, and we're going to look at verse 6. Matthew 26 and verse 6. And it says, and when Jesus was in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, a woman came to him having an alabaster flask of very costly fragrant oil, and she poured it on his head as he sat at the table. But when his disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, why this waste? For this fragrant oil might have been sold for much and given to the poor. But when Jesus was aware of it, he said to them, why do you trouble the woman? For she has done a good work for me. For you have the poor with you always, but me you do not have always. For in pouring this fragrant oil on my body, she did it for my burial. Assuredly, I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the world, what this woman has done will also be told as a memorial to her. Now, here's the thing. This woman who anoints Jesus' head for burial, she is honored by Jesus. Once again, we see a woman being affirmed and honored by Jesus. She is shown as virtuous. How was she honored? We don't even know what this woman's name is. As my friend Nick Quint said, we don't know what her name is, but they knew what her name was. They knew who this woman was. And Jesus said, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told as a memorial to her. So this is honoring her, because the way you honored someone in the ancient world was to talk about the good thing that they have done publicly. And Jesus said, well, she has done a good work. So her good work to this day, even right here by me, is being proclaimed. This honors the woman. She is being shown as virtuous for the good, virtuous work that she did. Once again, we see a female disciple of Jesus being honored, being seen or being portrayed as virtuous. We see this taking place where she is concerned. And of course, one of the things we also said in closing this off and talking about Jesus showing that his disciples, especially his female disciples, are virtuous. Remember, Lynn Cohick said that one of the ways you would protect a woman's modesty was by they would portray a philosophical school as a community or as a family. What did Jesus say in Matthew chapter 12? There's other places we could also look, but we're going to look at one. Matthew chapter 12, and look at verse 47. Matthew 12 and verse 47. Then one said to him, "Look, your mother and your brother are standing outside seeking to speak with you." But he answered and said to the one who told him, "Who is my mother? Who are my brothers?" And he stretched out his hand towards his disciples and said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." What is Jesus doing? He is saying, my disciples are a family. My disciple is a community. It's a family. What did Lynn Cohick said? That often what philosophical schools would do would be to present their school as a community or as a family to protect the modesty of the women. Again, I think this is what Jesus is. This is what's being done here. Those who follow our brothers and sisters in the household of God, in the school of God, in the household of God, they are brothers and sisters. All of this, again, is to show these are virtuous people. There is no hanky-panky going on. There's nothing improper going on, because these are all virtuous people and these are virtuous women. This is what Jesus, this is what the Gospels, how the Gospels are portraying the woman. They are portrayed as virtuous. Now, another possible reason I believe Jesus' female disciples, and I'm going to close with this, that they are presented in the Gospel as virtuous women. Another reason, here's the last reason I'm going to give you, is because of the lack of detailed information about them. Let me say it again. Another possible reason, I'm going to use the word possible, but I believe it's true once I give you the evidence of why I think this is true. Another possible reason I believe Jesus' female disciples are presented in the Gospels as virtuous women is because of the lack of detailed information about them. In studying this, one of the things I came across consistently was the complaint that we don't hear the voices of the women in the Gospels or in the book of Acts. We don't have any really long speeches except for Mary's and Elizabeth in the story of, when Mary's told John the Baptist is going to be born, Mary proclaims the Magnificat, and she gives a very long presentation, a very long speech. But other than that, you really don't hear any long speeches from women. You don't hear them in the book of Acts. You don't really see it in the Gospels. There's nothing very long. Now, to be honest, you don't hear long speeches in the Gospels from men either, or from any of the any of the male disciples. But definitely in the book of Acts, you don't really see, you got a long speech, you got long speeches by Paul, long speeches by Peter, long speeches by Stephen, but no long speeches by women. And definitely in the Gospels, we don't see it. We don't really see women speaking and preaching. Though my suggestion is, along with Joan Taylor, is that dual is that the women are going out proclaiming the kingdom with the men, okay? But why don't we see more of the women speaking? And I saw this as a complaint in many of the feminist scholars who are writing, so that we don't see the women speaking. And some of them have a problem with that, which I can understand why. So this is one of the things that have bothered many feminist scholars, that very little is said about female disciples of Jesus, and very little is said by female disciples of Jesus in the Gospels or in the book of Acts. So like I said, we don't have long speeches. Why? Why is this? Well, but let me say this too. All of the women that I just mentioned to you about, Mary, the Syrophoenician woman, the woman in Matthew 26 who anoints Jesus' head for burial, we don't get a lot of detail about them either. We get a lot of detail about, like, the Apostle Paul. We have a lot of detail about him, but we don't get a lot of detail about these women. They're mentioned. Romans chapter 16, Paul mentions a lot of women, but we don't have a lot of detail about them. Why? Here is a possible suggestion why, and I believe that this could explain why, and also it could be a way, again, of showing that these women are virtuous. According to Dr. Joan Taylor, in the culture of the ancient world, a good woman and her virtue if she was a good woman of virtue, was not talked about. Let me say that again. And this is from the book Jewish Women Philosophers. In the ancient culture, in the culture of the ancient world, a woman of virtue, if she was seen as a good woman, if she was seen as a woman of virtue, she was not talked about if she was a woman of virtue. Not talking about a woman in detail is a sign of just how virtuous she was. Let me say it again. Not talking about a woman in detail was a sign of just how virtuous she actually was. Let me read to you some things that she wrote in the book Jewish Women Philosophers in the first century. Let me find it here. She says, quote, ideally, no one should have cause to mention a good woman. Even her virtue should not be a reason for anyone to discuss her. This idea is already found in Thucydides, who was an Athenian historian in 4 BC. He writes, quote, this is what he writes, and this is from a funeral oration that was given by the Athenian general Pericles. And Pericles, in speaking to the woman when he was given this oration, when he was doing the Peloponnesian War, and there's a funeral for all the men that have died. He's speaking to the wives, the widows of the men who would die, and he says to them, your reputation is glorious if there is the least possible talk about you among men, whether in praise or in blame. This is what he says to the women. Let me say it again. He said to the women, your reputation, to the women, your reputation is glorious if there is the least possible talk about you among men, whether in praise or blame. So a woman's reputation was even more glorious if men talk the least about them, if they talk the least about their virtue. Okay, I know that seems strange, but this is one of the ways that it could be viewed. Let me read to you from another quote from the book, Jewish Women Philosophers of First Century Alexandria. She says, quote, for example, in an inscription from Rome, a son's funeral oration for his mother sums up the idea. And this is what the son says. My dearest mother deserved all the greatest praise because in modesty, uprightness, purity, obedience, wool-working, diligence, and faithfulness, she was equal and similar to other good women. Now, all of these things mentioned here in the first century were considered virtues. So modesty, uprightness, purity, obedience, wool-working, diligence, faithfulness, in all of these things, she was equal and similar to other good women. Now, Joan Taylor goes on to say, one might expect her son would have said that she was outstanding. I mean, you'd think that the son would go, my mother was just outstanding. But that would have made her too exceptional, and her virtue was better protected by being one of many. Notice what she said. Her virtue was better protected by being one of many. He notes that, quote, praise for all good women is customarily simple and similar because sufficient is the fact that they have all done the same good deeds worthy of reputation. A good woman has a good reputation. A good woman has a good reputation, but does not seem exceptional. So one of the things that was understood was that you don't cause women to be looked upon publicly. You don't speak about them in detail. The less you say about them, the more glorious their reputation. Let me read to you one more thing. It says, even when praising her in a funeral oration, just like we read, one should not discuss her specifically too much. While men may be praised by distinctive features and action, this kind of focus on individuality is not appropriate in regards to good women. A good woman leads a quiet and modest life of virtue, focusing on her home and family, and nothing much should ever be said about her. Philo's good woman conforms to this pattern perfectly. And this is said also within the context of the female therapeutic. So again, the idea here is that in the ancient world, there was this idea that by speaking less of a woman, you are actually showing how virtuous she was. So what I am suggesting, what I want to suggest, and what I am suggesting, is that the writers of the gospel, by mentioning the woman, but by not going into detail about them, they are demonstrating how virtuous these sisters are to the readers or listeners. Now, I wonder, was this, Thucydides wrote this, the historian, he wrote this in 4 BC. Would this also been carried over into the 1st century? Well, I was reading the book about by Susan Hyland called A Modest Apostle, Thecla and the History of Woman in the, or I believe in the early church. She has a quote from Plutarch, who was a philosopher in the late 1st century, early 2nd century. And he writes, I do not hold the same opinion as Thucydides, for he declares that the best woman is she about whom there is the least talk among persons outside regarding either censure or commendation, or blame and praise, feeling that the name of the good woman, like her person, ought to be shut up indoors and never go out. So again, by the first and second century, this idea was still there that you do not praise a woman too much, because the lack of detail shows just how virtuous she was. I know it seems strange, I know it seems backwards, but this is at least one of, I want to suggest this as one of the reasons why we don't see a lot of mention in detail of the women that we see mentioned in the Gospels, in the book of Acts, and even in Paul. They're mentioned, but we don't go into great detail. They're portrayed as women of virtue in the less detail. If this is still going on in the 1st century, this would be a signal to the people who are hearing these women being mentioned. Their names are being mentioned. Some of their deeds are being mentioned, but it's not in great detail. But this would suggest to the 1st century reader that these are women of great virtue. Because in this instance, less is better. Less is better. The less you talk about them, the more virtuous they are. This could be, I'm suggesting, a reason why we do not hear a lot of detail about these women and their lives. Just a suggestion. I put it out there for your consideration. But what all of this demonstrates is that these women were virtuous, that there was nothing scandalous going on with Jesus' male and female disciples. What this altogether says is that Jesus' disciple, his group, his students, they were a virtuous group. They were a virtuous school. They were a virtuous family. All right? So that's what I wanted to share with you today, that while it could have been scandalous to some, and we'll get into some more of this next week, that the way these women are being portrayed, as we look at these little indicators, the way that they are being portrayed is that they are women of virtue, and that there is nothing scandalous or improper going on. I hope you got something out of this. I hope you enjoyed this and that you learned a lot. If you did and you're watching this, let me know in the comment section. We're going to upload this to our KIC TV YouTube channel. So it should be up there in a couple of hours. And so if you would please direct people over to KIC TV, or keep it in contact with Mike, where they can watch this and other videos. And if you are watching this on KIC TV, our YouTube channel, please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. This helps the algorithm to send out our message in our YouTube channel out to more people. Thank you so much for joining with me this evening in this study. We're going to be talking more about this tomorrow night. So join us tomorrow night. For those of you that are watching, join us tomorrow night live from the Oasis as we talk more about, were there female leaders among Jesus in the Jesus movement? Were there female leaders in the Jesus movement, as we talk more about who's the boss, men and women, in cultural and biblical context. Thank you for joining me, and Lord willing, I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.